The lobby of the Grandview Plaza Hotel was a symphony of clinking crystal and hushed, wealthy conversations, until the distinct, cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the polished marble floor. Officer Mitchell Trent thought he was asserting his authority, aggressively detaining two black men he deemed suspicious and out of place. He wore a smug, victorious smile, entirely unaware that the men currently locked in his iron grip weren't trespassers at all. They were deep-cover federal agents, and Trent had just blindly walked straight into the fragile epicenter of a multi-million-dollar federal sting operation. The rain falling on the streets of downtown Chicago did nothing to dampen the opulent atmosphere inside the Grandview Plaza Hotel. Inside the sprawling lobby, gilded chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the imported Italian marble beneath the feet of the city's most affluent elite. Soft jazz floated from a grand piano in the corner, masking the quiet murmurs of business deals and high society gossip. Seated in a velvet booth near the towering glass entrance were Special Agents David Collins and Samuel Brooks. To the untrained eye, they were simply two men enjoying a quiet drink, perhaps waiting for a colleague or a client. But beneath their relaxed postures and casual designer clothing lay the coiled tension of predators lying in wait. David, a seasoned veteran with a sharply trimmed beard and piercing brown eyes, slowly swirled the untouched bourbon in his glass. He wore a high-end charcoal turtleneck and a tailored blazer, projecting the image of a wealthy, if understated, entrepreneur. Across from him, Samuel slouched slightly in his seat, his broad shoulders relaxed. Samuel was younger, built like a linebacker, wearing a designer streetwear hoodie that cost more than most people made in a week, paired with pristine, limited-edition sneakers. Their attire was carefully selected. They were meant to blend into the modern, new-money crowd that frequently occupied the Grandview, while subtly signaling that they had the muscle and the capital to belong in the criminal underworld they were currently infiltrating. "Target is still in the suite," a voice crackled sharply in David's right ear, transmitted through an earpiece so small it was practically invisible. It was Thomas Harding, the operations lead coordinator, speaking from a mobile command center, parked 3 blocks away in a dimly lit alley. "He's been pacing for 20 minutes. The buyers are late, and he's getting nervous. Hold your positions, gentlemen. We do not move until the merchandise is physically in the room." "Copy that, Command. We're holding," David murmured softly, bringing his glass to his lips to mask the movement of his mouth. Tonight was the culmination of an agonizing 14-month undercover operation known as Operation Checkmate. The target upstairs in Penthouse Suite 412 was Victor Cross, a ruthless international arms broker who had been flooding the Midwest with untraceable military-grade weaponry. Cross was notoriously paranoid, surrounded by layers of security and rarely showing his face at a transaction. But tonight was different. The deal was worth over $50 million, and Cross had insisted on being present to verify the funds. If David and Samuel could secure the lobby and ensure the buyers made it up to the suite uninterrupted, the FBI's tactical teams would breach the doors the moment the weapons were exposed, bringing down Cross's entire empire in one fell swoop. The stakes were astronomical. Hundreds of lives depended on taking Cross off the streets. However, the meticulously planned federal operation had completely failed to account for Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was the evening manager of the Grandview Plaza, a man whose rigid posture and pinched features suggested a lifetime of looking down his nose at the world. For the past 20 minutes, Pendleton had been glaring at David and Samuel from behind the mahogany concierge desk. To Pendleton, the Grandview was a sanctuary for a very specific type of clientele, and the two black men in the velvet booth simply didn't fit his narrow, prejudiced definition of who belonged. He ignored their expensive clothing and the quiet, respectful way they kept to themselves. Instead, he saw Samuel's hoodie and David's unwavering confidence as a direct threat to the hotel's pristine ecosystem. Driven by his own unchecked biases, Pendleton picked up the telephone and bypassed the hotel's internal security team entirely. He dialed the direct number of a local beat cop who frequently moonlighted for the hotel in unofficial capacities, Officer Mitchell Trent. Officer Trent was a man who wore his badge not as a shield for the public, but as a blunt instrument of personal power. Known in his precinct for a heavy hand and a troubling history of excessive force, complaints that mysteriously vanished into bureaucratic red tape, Trent thrived on intimidation. When he received Pendleton's call about two suspicious urban individuals loitering in the lobby and making the guests uncomfortable, Trent didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. His mind instantly filled the blanks with tired, racist stereotypes, and he eagerly headed toward the Grandview Plaza, ready to flex his authority. The heavy glass doors of the hotel swung open, letting in a gust of damp, cold air. Officer Trent stepped into the lobby, his heavy black boots thudding loudly against the marble. He paused, adjusting his heavy utility belt with a self-important swagger, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the velvet booth in the corner. David spotted the officer instantly, his federal agent instincts automatically tracking the new variable entering the environment. "We have a local uniform in the lobby," David whispered, leaning casually onto the table. "He's looking right at us." Samuel didn't turn his head, merely shifting his eyes. "You think Cross has a lookout on the payroll, using a dirty cop to sweep the lobby?" "Maybe," David replied, his voice barely a breath. "Or maybe we just drew the wrong kind of attention. Whatever happens, keep it cool. We cannot blow our cover. If Cross's men are watching, they need to see two low-level associates minding their own business. If we flash our badges now, this entire operation goes up in smoke." Trent was walking toward them now, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his taser, his jaw set in a hard, confrontational line. The wealthy patrons around them began to quiet down, sensing the impending conflict. The soft jazz playing in the background suddenly felt entirely out of place as the shadow of the officer fell over their table. David took a slow, deep breath, mentally preparing for a delicate dance of de-escalation, unaware that Officer Trent had no interest in asking questions. Trent was there to make a point, and he was completely oblivious to the federal firestorm he was about to ignite. "Let me see your room keys, right now." The demand was barked loudly, deliberately meant to carry across the quiet lobby. Officer Mitchell Trent stood over the velvet booth, his chest puffed out, his hand still resting heavily on his utility belt. He didn't offer a greeting, nor did he ask if they needed assistance. His eyes darted between David and Samuel, with a mixture of deep-seated contempt and eager anticipation. David slowly set his bourbon glass down on the table, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. He knew the protocol for interacting with local law enforcement while deep undercover. Compliance was key, but over-compliance could look suspicious to any criminal lookouts watching the lobby. He had to play the part of a wealthy, slightly annoyed civilian. "Good evening, officer," David said, his tone smooth, measured, and perfectly polite. "We aren't guests of the hotel. We're just having a drink and waiting for a business associate to arrive." Trent scoffed, a short, ugly sound that drew the attention of an elderly couple sitting 2 tables away. "Waiting for a business associate? In gear like that?" Trent's eyes raked over Samuel's designer hoodie, his lip curling in disgust. "This is a 5-star establishment, not a street corner. You don't look like you have business here. Let me see some identification, both of you. Now." Samuel's jaw tightened. As a former Marine turned FBI agent, his instinct was to stand up and forcefully demand to know what reasonable suspicion the officer had to demand their papers. but he felt David's foot tap gently against his own beneath the table, a silent command to hold the line. "Officer," Samuel said, keeping his voice level, though a dangerous edge crept into the timbre of his words. "With all due respect, we're sitting quietly in a public lounge, drinking beverages we paid for. We haven't broken any laws, and we aren't causing a disturbance. We'd appreciate it if you let us finish our drinks." "I don't care what you appreciate," Trent snapped, stepping closer, closing the physical distance in a textbook intimidation tactic. His face was flushed with the sudden rush of unchallenged authority. "People like you think you can just wander into places you don't belong and play the victim when you get called out. I'm telling you one last time, IDs on the table, or you're going to find out how we handle trespassers in my precinct." In David's earpiece, the situation upstairs was escalating. "David, talk to me!" Thomas Harding's voice barked in his ear, laced with anxiety. "What's the disruption in the lobby? Cross's buyers are 2 minutes out. They are pulling up to the valet right now. You need to keep that lobby completely clear of police presence, or the buyers will spook and abort the deal." David's mind raced, calculating a dozen different variables in a fraction of a second. If he handed over his real FBI credentials, Trent would likely announce it out loud, blowing their cover instantly. The buyers walking through the front door would hear it, see the cop, and run. The $50 million deal would vanish, and Victor Cross would slip away into the wind. If he handed over his fake, deep cover alias ID, Trent would run it through the system. When it flagged as a restricted federal alias, Trent might arrest them for possessing forged documents, causing a massive physical scene. The only option was to stall, absorb the abuse, and let the sting operation unfold around them. "Officer," David said, raising his hand slowly, palms open to show he was not a threat. "We don't want any trouble. We don't have our IDs on us. We left our wallets in the car. But if you'd like us to leave, we will gladly pay our tab and walk out the front door. Just give us 30 seconds to settle up. You think you can just walk away?" Trent sneered, his anger boiling over at the perceived disrespect of not instantly receiving identification. "You think you make the rules here? Stand up. Both of you. Stand up right now." Before David could respond, Trent reached across the small table and grabbed Samuel violently by the shoulder of his hoodie, attempting to haul the larger man out of the booth. Samuel's combat reflexes flared instantly. In a blur of motion, Samuel shifted his weight, easily breaking Trent's grip without throwing a strike, simply twisting his shoulder away with practiced, immovable force. To Trent, a man used to civilians cowering in fear, this defensive maneuver was an unforgivable act of aggression. "Resisting arrest!" Trent yelled, his voice echoing loudly off the marble walls, shattering the elegant atmosphere of the lobby completely. Guests gasped, some standing up from their seats, while Arthur Pendleton watched from the concierge desk with a satisfied, smug expression. Trent yanked a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and put your hands behind your backs. Do it now before I deploy my taser. David, the buyers are walking through the revolving doors right now," Harding's voice screamed through the earpiece. "Do not engage the officer. Repeat, do not blow your cover. Let him take you. Just keep the lobby calm." David met Samuel's eyes. A silent, agonizing communication passed between the two elite federal agents. They were highly trained operatives, armed with concealed Glock 19s and absolute federal authority. They could have Trent on the floor and disarmed in 3 seconds. But doing so meant sacrificing 14 months of grueling, dangerous work. Slowly, deliberately, David turned around and placed his hands behind his back. "Do what he says, Sam," David said, his voice cold and flat. Samuel exhaled a slow, furious breath, his massive shoulders tense as steel. and turned his back to the officer. Trent practically lunged forward, grabbing Samuel's wrists and ratcheting the cold metal cuffs down so tightly they bit instantly into the agent's skin. He shoved Samuel roughly against the edge of the velvet booth before turning to David, slapping the second pair of cuffs onto his wrists with unnecessary, brutal force. The clicks of the locking mechanism sounded like gunshots in the suddenly silent lobby. "Thought you were tough, didn't you?" Trent whispered maliciously, leaning in close so only the two agents could hear him. "Thought you could bring your street garbage into this hotel. You're both going down for trespassing, resisting, and whatever else I decide to find in your pockets." As Trent aggressively shoved them forward, parading the two handcuffed federal agents through the lobby like hunting trophies, the front doors of the Grandview Plaza opened. 3 men in sharp suits walked in, Victor Cross's buyers. They barely spared a glance at the 2 black men being arrested by a local cop, assuming it was just routine city riffraff being cleared out. The buyers walked straight past them and headed for the elevators. The sting was still intact. But as Trent forced David and Samuel toward the hotel's back security office, a dark, terrifying storm was brewing behind David's calm exterior. Officer Trent had won the battle in the lobby, but he was completely, blissfully ignorant of the absolute hellfire he had just invited upon his own life. Officer Mitchell Trent practically shoved David and Samuel through the heavy oak doors that separated the luxurious lobby from the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the hotel's back-of-house operations. The transition was jarring. Gone were the sounds of smooth jazz and the scent of expensive perfume, replaced by the low hum of industrial air conditioning and the smell of industrial floor cleaner. Trent maintained a white-knuckled grip on Samuel's collar, relishing the physical dominance he felt he had asserted. Arthur Pendleton, the hotel manager, trailed closely behind them, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. Pendleton's face was a mask of vindicated superiority, completely oblivious to the fact that his prejudice was actively sabotaging a massive federal mandate. They reached a windowless security office at the end of the hall. Trent pushed Samuel hard against a bank of unused metal lockers, then kicked David's legs apart to force him into a vulnerable, spread-eagle stance against the cinderblock wall. The steel cuffs dug agonizingly into David's wrists, but he focused entirely on the faint crackle of the earpiece hidden deep in his left ear canal. "Buyers are in the elevator. ETA to the suite is 40 seconds. Thomas Harding's voice echoed in the tiny speaker. "Tactical teams are stacked and ready in the stairwells. Hold your ground, David. You and Samuel just bought us the window we needed." David exhaled slowly, letting his cheek rest against the cool, painted cinder block. He shot a sidelong glance at Samuel. The younger agent was a statue, his jaw locked, eyes burning with a silent, controlled fury. Samuel was strong enough to snap the handcuffs if he truly exerted himself, but he understood the assignment. The greater good was happening 4 floors above their heads. "All right, let's see what we've got here," Trent sneered, stepping back to admire his handiwork. He unclipped his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Bravo. I've got 2 suspects in custody at the Grandview Plaza. Trespassing, resisting arrest, and causing a public disturbance. I'm conducting a search of their persons now before I request transport." "Copy that, 4 Bravo," the dispatcher replied with a crackle. Pendleton folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I want them permanently banned from the premises, Officer Trent. This sort of element completely undermines the reputation we've built here. They were eyeing the guests, casing the place. I could tell the moment they walked in." "Don't worry, Arthur," Trent replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "They won't be coming back here. By the time I'm done writing this report, they'll be lucky to see the outside of a cell for the next 48 hours. Trent stepped up behind David and began a rough, deeply unprofessional pat-down. He slapped at David's pockets, moving up his torso. As his hands brushed the left side of David's tailored blazer, Trent froze. The officer's eyes went wide, His hand hovered, then desperately patted the heavy, solid shape concealed in a holster beneath David's arm. Trent jumped back as if he had been burned, his hand dropping instantly to his own service weapon, unsnapping the retention holster. "He's got a gun! He's armed!" Trent screamed, his voice pitching up in sudden, genuine panic. He drew his weapon and pointed it directly at David's back. "Do not move! Do not breathe!" Pendleton let out a small, terrified gasp and scrambled backward into the hallway. Trent moved to Samuel, keeping his gun trained on David, and roughly patted Samuel's waistband. He felt the unmistakable outline of a concealed Glock 19 nestled at the small of the agent's back. "Two guns! They're both packing!" Trent yelled, his chest heaving. The dynamic in the room shifted from a petty power trip to an incredibly dangerous standoff. Trent was a poorly trained, highly reactive officer who now believed he had cornered two heavily armed criminals. His finger trembled near the trigger of his service pistol. "Who the hell are you people? You're here to rob the place, aren't you? Hit a high roller upstairs?" "Officer," David said, his voice calm, projecting a steadying frequency meant to de-escalate a panicked shooter. "Take a deep breath. My wallet is in my front right pocket. If you look inside—" "Shut your mouth!" Trent barked, pressing the barrel of his gun against the back of David's neck. "You don't give the orders here. You don't speak unless I tell you to speak." In David's ear, the audio feed from command erupted. "Breach! Breach! Breach!" Harding roared. Over the microscopic speaker, David heard the distant, muffled sound of explosive charges blowing the hinges off the penthouse doors 4 stories up, followed by the chaotic shouting of FBI SWAT operators swarming the room. "FBI, get on the ground! Show me your hands!" The overlapping screams of the tactical team leaked through the earpiece. David closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips despite the gun pressed to his spine. They had done it. Victor Cross and his buyers were in custody. The $50 million deal was seized. Operation Checkmate was a resounding success. "What are you smiling at?" Trent demanded, noticing the shift in David's posture. Trent reached out, grabbed the collar of David's jacket, and yanked him backward. As he did, he noticed the faint, clear plastic wire of the earpiece snaking down the back of David's neck. Trent frowned in confusion, reaching out and brutally ripping the earpiece from David's ear. He held the tiny device in his hand, listening to the furious tactical radio traffic, now buzzing audibly in the quiet security room. "What is this?" Trent muttered, his arrogant confidence suddenly faltering. He looked from the sophisticated communication device to David's calm, completely unbothered expression, and then to Samuel, who was now staring at Trent with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. Trent had pulled the thread, and the entire fabric of his authority was about to unravel. "I asked you a question," Trent yelled, his voice cracking slightly as panic began to override his anger. He crushed the earpiece in his hand. "What kind of communication gear is this? Who are you talking to?" Samuel finally spoke, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder in the small room. "You should have checked the ID, Trent. You should have just looked at the wallet." Before Trent could respond, before he could even process the warning, the heavy oak doors leading from the lobby to the back hallway didn't just open. They were violently thrown open, slamming against the plaster walls with a deafening crash. Heavy combat boots hit the linoleum floor with the synchronized rhythm of a marching army. Arthur Pendleton, who had been cowering in the hallway, let out a high-pitched scream as he was abruptly shoved aside by a wall of olive-drab tactical gear. 4 heavily armed FBI SWAT operators flooded into the narrow hallway, their assault rifles raised in a low-ready position. They wore heavy plate carriers emblazoned with large yellow letters, FBI. Behind them strode Thomas Harding, the special agent in charge of Operation Checkmate. Harding was a man of terrifying presence, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a tactical vest over a white button-down shirt. His face was a mask of cold, uncompromising federal fury. Trent spun around, his service weapon still drawn. When he saw the tactical team filtering into the security room, his brain completely short-circuited. "Drop your weapons! I am a Chicago police officer. Drop them!" Trent screamed, pointing his gun erratically at the federal agents. "Lower your weapon right now, officer," Harding ordered. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice possessed an absolute, crushing authority that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "I am Special Agent Thomas Harding, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have your firearm pointed at 2 of my undercover operatives. Holster your weapon immediately, or my men will put you on the ground." The SWAT operators simultaneously raised their rifles, centering the red dots of their optics directly onto Trent's chest. Trent's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He looked from the heavily armed tactical team to Harding, and finally back to David and Samuel. The men he had just racially profiled, assaulted, and handcuffed. Slowly, agonizingly, Trent lowered his gun and fumbled it blindly back into its holster. He took a step back, hitting the edge of a metal desk. "Keys," Harding demanded, holding out an open palm. Trent couldn't speak. His throat worked, but no sound came out. He reached to his belt with trembling fingers, unclipped his handcuff keys, and dropped them into Harding's hand. Harding stepped past the paralyzed officer. He moved to Samuel first, inserting the key and freeing the massive agent's wrists. Samuel rolled his shoulders, rubbing the deep red welts the tight steel had left on his skin. Harding then unlocked David's cuffs. David slowly stood to his full height, adjusting the lapels of his charcoal blazer. He turned to face Officer Trent, his expression chillingly calm. "You didn't tell me," Trent stammered, his arrogant bravado entirely shattered. He looked like a terrified child. "You didn't show me your badges. If you had just said you were federal agents." "If we had identified ourselves, the international arms dealer sitting in the penthouse upstairs would have been tipped off," David interrupted, his voice razor-sharp. "You compromised a 14-month multi-agency federal operation because you couldn't handle the sight of 2 black men sitting in a nice hotel." Harding stepped squarely into Trent's personal space. "Officer Mitchell Trent," Harding read off the man's nameplate. "I have everything on audio. I heard the entire interaction. I heard you demand identification without reasonable suspicion. I heard you escalate to physical violence against my agents. You violated their civil rights, you assaulted federal officers, and you nearly cost the United States government $50 million and a highly sensitive arrest." Arthur Pendleton, trembling violently, poked his head into the doorway. "Agent Harding, sir. We had no idea. We were just trying to maintain the standards of the hotel. I called the officer because they looked out of place." Samuel took a step toward the door, and Pendleton instantly shrank back. "Out of place?" Samuel asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Or out of your preferred demographic, Arthur? You used this badge to enforce your own bigotry. And now you're both going to answer for it." "Agent Collins," Harding said, not taking his eyes off Trent. "Are you and Agent Brooks injured?" "Just bruised wrists, sir," David replied, picking up his Glock from where Trent had tossed it on a desk, checking the chamber, and sliding it smoothly back into his shoulder holster. "Good," Harding said. He turned to one of the SWAT operators. "Disarm Officer Trent. Take his badge and his radio. I want him detained in one of the transport vans. I will be making a personal phone call to the Chicago Police Superintendent regarding his immediate suspension, pending a federal investigation for assault and civil rights violations." "You can't do this!" Trent pleaded, his voice cracking as 2 SWAT operators moved forward, stripping his gun belt away. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" David said. stepping right into Trent's face as the operators pulled the disgraced cop toward the door, "is to protect and serve the community, not to act like a thug with a shiny piece of metal on your chest. You thought we were an easy target. You thought nobody would care." David leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You chose the wrong men today, Trent." The journey back through the opulent lobby of the Grandview Plaza Hotel was a stark, humiliating reversal of fortune for Officer Mitchell Trent. Just 10 minutes prior, he had strutted across this very same imported Italian marble, his chest puffed out with the arrogant thrill of unquestioned authority. He had paraded David Collins and Samuel Brooks like prized catches, eager to display his dominance to the wealthy onlookers. Now, the heavy, unforgiving silence of the lobby was directed entirely at him. Stripped of his service weapon, his badge and his radio, Trent was being forcefully escorted by 2 towering FBI SWAT operators. His wrists were secured behind his back, not with his own steel handcuffs, but with heavy-duty federal zip ties that offered absolutely no give. The wealthy patrons of the Grandview Plaza, who had previously murmured in quiet approval or feigned ignorance when the 2 black men were arrested, now stared in absolute, unbridled shock. The soft jazz piano had completely stopped. The pianist sat frozen on his bench. Trent's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, unable to meet the bewildered gazes of the elite guests he had sworn he was protecting. He could hear the faint, frantic whispering rippling through the lounge, the rustle of silk and the clinking of crystal suddenly replaced by the sharp, terrifying reality of a federal raid. Arthur Pendleton, the hotel manager, trailed awkwardly behind the tactical procession, his usual pristine composure utterly shattered. He was sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie loosened around his neck. He practically vibrated with panic, desperately trying to distance himself from the disgraced officer he had personally summoned. "Everyone, please remain calm. It's a misunderstanding, just a routine security matter," Pendleton squeaked, his voice cracking pitifully. He raised his hands, trying to placate the staring guests, but no one was listening to him. Their eyes were fixed on the tactical gear, the assault rifles, and the sheer, overwhelming presence of the federal government occupying their exclusive sanctuary. Special Agent in Charge, Thomas Harding, emerged from the back hallway, walking shoulder to shoulder with David and Samuel. The 2 undercover agents looked completely unbothered, their strides confident and purposeful. David adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal turtleneck, while Samuel cracked his knuckles, the tension of the ordeal bleeding away into the cold, calculated focus of a successful mission. As they reached the center of the lobby, the gold-plated elevator doors pinged softly, sliding open to reveal a scene that would undoubtedly make the front page of every major newspaper in the country. A second FBI SWAT team stepped out of the elevator, surrounding 3 men in tailored suits. Leading the pack was Victor Cross, the notorious international arms dealer, a man who had eluded capture by Interpol and federal agencies for over a decade, looked ragged and furious. His designer jacket was torn at the shoulder, a testament to the violent, dynamic breach that had just occurred in his penthouse suite. His wrists were heavily shackled in steel, and a tactical operator held firmly onto his bicep. Behind him, his 2 buyers looked equally terrified, their briefcases, containing $50 million in untraceable bearer bonds and cryptocurrency hard drives, securely in the hands of federal evidence technicians. David and Samuel paused, watching the architect of the Midwest's illegal weapons trade being marched into the lobby. Cross's eyes locked onto David, scanning the agent's face. For a brief second, confusion washed over the criminal mastermind's features, recognizing the man he had seen loitering downstairs in the lobby via his security feeds. Then, the horrific realization dawned on him. He hadn't been betrayed by his own people. He had been systematically dismantled by ghosts. "Take them to the armored transports," Harding commanded, his voice slicing through the tense air of the lobby. "Cross goes into isolation. Do not let him speak to the buyers." As Cross was hauled toward the revolving glass doors, the flashing red and blue lights of a dozen local police cruisers illuminated the rainy Chicago night, bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel. Captain James Donovan of the local precinct pushed his way through the glass doors, looking furious and severely out of breath. He was flanked by 3 patrol officers. Donovan had received an emergency, top priority call directly from the FBI director of the Chicago field office, informing him that one of his men had just assaulted deep-cover federal agents and actively interfered with a Tier 1 national security operation. Donovan's eyes scanned the chaotic scene, bypassing the SWAT operators and the arrested arms dealers, until they landed on Officer Trent. "Trent!" Captain Donovan roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He stormed across the lobby, his face purple with rage. "What in God's name have you done?" Trent, shivering despite the warmth of the room, looked up at his commanding officer with terrified, tear-filled eyes. "Captain, I swear I didn't know. They didn't show me badges. The hotel manager called me." "Shut your mouth," Donovan barked, stepping inches from Trent's face. "You don't speak. You bypassed dispatch. You initiated an unapproved rogue detention without probable cause. You put your hands on 2 federal agents holding the perimeter on a $50 million sting. Do you have any idea the magnitude of the hurricane you just brought down on this precinct?" Donovan turned to Agent Harding, his expression shifting from rage to profound, damage-controlling apology. "Agent Harding, I cannot express how entirely unacceptable this is. Trent acted completely outside of departmental policy. He is stripped of his police powers effective immediately." Harding's expression remained carved from stone. "Your apologies won't stop the Department of Justice, Captain. Officer Trent isn't just fired. He is currently under federal arrest. And as for the manager who enabled this—" Harding slowly turned his gaze toward Arthur Pendleton, who looked as though he might faint. "We will be taking a very close look at the Grandview Plaza's security protocols." The following morning, the atmosphere inside the FBI's Chicago field office was a whirlwind of frantic, organized chaos. The takedown of Victor Cross was being hailed as the most significant blow to organized arms trafficking in a decade. Telephones rang incessantly, evidence technicians processed the seized bearer bonds, and federal prosecutors paced the hallways, eagerly preparing the airtight indictments against Cross and his associates. But inside a soundproof glass-walled conference room on the secure 7th floor, the mood was decidedly heavier. David and Samuel sat at a long mahogany table, nursing steaming cups of black coffee. The adrenaline of the operation had long since faded, leaving behind the dull, exhausting ache of a mission completed. Across from them sat Thomas Harding, a thick manila folder resting on the table between them. "The director wants to give you both commendations," Harding said, his tone devoid of its usual sharp edge, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. "What you two did in that lobby, maintaining your cover while being actively targeted and assaulted by a bad cop. It takes an unprecedented level of discipline. You saved the operation." Samuel stared into his coffee cup, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a slow sigh. "We didn't do it to save the operation, Tom. We did it because we know how to survive a traffic stop. We know how to survive a Mitchell Trent. If we fought back, if we broke his jaw like he deserved, we wouldn't have been federal agents in his eyes. We would have just been 2 angry black men, and he would have shot us. It's a script we learned long before we ever picked up these badges." David nodded slowly, his expression grim. Trent didn't care about the law. He cared about his ego. He saw 2 men who didn't fit his narrow, prejudiced worldview, and he decided to punish us for existing in a space he deemed above our station. It just so happens that this time he picked on the federal government. Harding pressed his lips into a thin line, tapping his index finger against the manila folder. Well, he is about to face the full, unmitigated wrath of that government. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division formally took over his case at 600 hours this morning. They are charging him with deprivation of rights under color of law. Because he was armed, and because he actively placed a loaded firearm against your spine, David, it's being bumped up to an aggravated felony. He's looking at 10 years in federal prison. What about his union? Samuel asked, leaning back in his chair. Cops like Trent always have someone waiting in the wings to scream about split-second decisions and officer safety. Harding pulled a glossy 8x10 photograph from the folder and slid it across the table. It was a high-resolution, digitally enhanced still frame from the Grandview Plaza's security cameras. It showed Trent aggressively grabbing Samuel by the hoodie, completely unprovoked. His union representative, Frank Russo, walked into the precinct last night, ready to tear the roof off, Harding explained, a grim satisfaction creeping into his voice. Then Captain Donovan showed Russo the unedited security footage, alongside the audio recording from your wire. Once Russo heard Trent blatantly fabricating charges and threatening you, he walked right back out. The union publicly distanced themselves at a press conference an hour ago. Trent is entirely on his own. He is radioactive. And Arthur Pendleton? David asked, his brown eyes narrowing slightly at the memory of the hotel manager's smug, vindictive face. The man who set the whole thing in motion? Harding allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. Pendleton made a monumental career-ending mistake. After we cleared the lobby last night, Pendleton panicked. He snuck into the hotel's server room and attempted to manually delete the security footage of the lobby confrontation, hoping to erase his own culpability in sicking Trent on you. He wanted to claim he simply called in a noise complaint and had no idea Trent would get violent. Samuel let out a short, cynical laugh. Let me guess, he didn't know we already had Cyber Division monitoring the hotel's mainframe. Exactly, Harding nodded. We mirrored their entire security drive the moment we set up the mobile command center 3 days ago. We have the pristine footage, but by attempting to delete it, Pendleton committed the federal crime of tampering with evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. The reality of the fallout was staggering. Pendleton, a man who had prided himself on controlling the pristine, elite environment of his luxury hotel, was currently sitting in a holding cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogance. The parent company of the Grandview Plaza, the massive Oakhaven Hospitality Group, had already issued a frantic public apology, immediately terminating Pendleton and promising a total overhaul of their security protocols to avoid a devastating federal lawsuit. They both thought they held all the cards, David murmured, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He looked out the window, watching the rain beat against the glass of the Chicago skyline. They thought the system was designed to protect them, to validate their biases. They never stopped to think that the system might finally bite back. Harding closed the manila folder, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. Operation Checkmate is closed. Cross is going away for the rest of his natural life. Take 72 hours of mandatory leave, gentlemen. Go home. Get some rest. You've earned it. As David and Samuel stood up to leave the conference room, the weight of the past 24 hours settled firmly on their shoulders. They had taken down an empire of illegal weapons, saving countless lives on the streets of the Midwest. But the victory felt deeply personal. They hadn't just defeated a mastermind criminal. They had stood in the face of raw, unchecked prejudice and let it completely destroy itself. Officer Mitchell Trent and Arthur Pendleton had tried to put them in their place, entirely unaware that the place these two men occupied was at the very top of the federal food chain. 6 months later, the bitter, freezing winds of November howled outside the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse, whipping through the streets of downtown Chicago. But the atmosphere inside courtroom 214 was infinitely colder. The sprawling room was a fortress of dark mahogany and polished brass, dominated by the imposing federal seal of the United States, mounted high above the judge's bench. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, civil rights advocates, and off-duty federal agents who had come to witness the final, crushing conclusion to a case that had captured the nation's undivided attention. Sitting at the prosecution's table, Special Agents David Collins and Samuel Brooks looked as immaculate and unbothered as they had on the night of the sting. They wore sharp, conservative Navy suits, their federal badges clipped securely to their belts beneath their tailored jackets. There was no anxiety in their posture, only the quiet, immovable resolve of men who had seen the absolute worst of society and lived to bring it to the light. Across the aisle, seated at the defense table, former Officer Mitchell Trent was a hollow, pathetic shell of the man who had swaggered through the Grandview Plaza Hotel. Stripped of his uniform, his badge, and the unchecked authority he had wielded like a weapon, Trent looked incredibly small. He wore an ill-fitting grey suit, his face pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He had spent the last 6 months out on bail, entirely ostracized by his former colleagues, hounded by the media, and staring down the barrel of a federal indictment that carried a mandatory prison sentence. There would be no trial. The evidence, the pristine, high-definition audio and video files secured by the FBI, was so overwhelmingly damning that Trent's defense attorney had practically begged the Department of Justice for a plea deal, which had been unceremoniously rejected. A few rows behind Trent sat Arthur Pendleton. The former luxury hotel manager looked completely unrecognizable. The stress of the federal investigation, combined with a brutal civil lawsuit from the Oak Haven Hospitality Group that had successfully stripped him of his pension and life savings, had aged him a decade. Pendleton had already pled guilty to federal evidence tampering. He was slated to serve 36 months in a minimum security federal facility, but the total destruction of his reputation and his carefully curated elitist lifestyle was a prison all its own. He sat with his head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the gallery. "All rise!" the bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the hushed murmurs of the courtroom. The Honorable Judge Wallace Barrett, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and absolute lack of tolerance for police misconduct, swept into the room. His black robes billowed behind him as he took his seat, his severe gaze immediately locking onto the defense table. "Be seated," Judge Barrett commanded. He opened the heavy case file in front of him, though he had clearly memorized every sordid detail of the incident. "We are here for the sentencing of Mitchell Trent. Before I deliver my ruling, the court recognizes the victims in this case. Special Agent Collins, I understand you have prepared a brief statement." David stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not look at the judge. Instead, he turned his body completely to face Mitchell Trent. Trent flinched, his eyes darting down to the table, unable to meet the unyielding, powerful gaze of the man he had once violently shoved against a cinder-block wall. "Mr. Trent," David began, his voice echoing with absolute clarity in the silent courtroom. Six months ago, you walked into a hotel lobby and saw a threat. You didn't see criminal activity. You didn't see a disturbance. You saw 2 black men existing in a space you decided we did not belong in. You used a badge, a sworn oath to protect the public, as a shield to enforce your own bigotry. You demanded our compliance, and when we offered it, you demanded our subjugation. The courtroom was so quiet that the faint ticking of the wall clock sounded like a drumbeat. Samuel watched his partner with quiet pride, his arms crossed over his broad chest. My partner and I survived that night because we are highly trained federal agents, David continued, his voice steady, carrying the weight of generations. We had an entire tactical team listening to our every breath. We had the power of the federal government behind us. But what haunts me, Mr. Trent, is what happens to the men who don't have an earpiece. What happens to the men who don't have badges of their own? You built a career preying on those without a voice, confident that the system would always look the other way. But the system caught you. Today, you are not a police officer. You are a criminal who abused his power, and you will finally face the exact same justice you so gleefully denied to others. David sat down. A heavy, profound silence hung in the air. Judge Barrett adjusted his glasses, his expression carved from stone as he looked down at the trembling defendant. Mr. Trent, you brought a loaded firearm to bear against the spine of a restrained federal agent. You compromised a Tier 1 national security operation. But beyond the staggering federal implications, your actions represent the most vile betrayal of the public trust. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore, and a danger to the citizens you swore to protect. Barrett struck his gavel, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. Mitchell Trent, it is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a period of 120 months, with no possibility of early parole. Bail is revoked. Officers, take him. 2 massive U.S. Marshals stepped forward instantly. Trent let out a choked, ragged sob as his hands were pulled behind his back. The familiar, cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the room. Only this time, they were locking around his own wrists. Trent was hauled away, dragging his feet, disappearing through the heavy wooden side door that led to the holding cells. Arthur Pendleton closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek as he realized he was next. 20 minutes later, David and Samuel pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the freezing Chicago air. The media flashes blinded them instantly, reporters shouting questions about the landmark sentencing. The agents ignored them all, walking shoulder to shoulder down the concrete steps. Special agent in charge, Thomas Harding, was waiting by a sleek, black government SUV at the curb. He didn't smile, but there was a distinct glimmer of profound respect in his eyes. "It's done," Harding said quietly, holding the rear door open. "Trent is on his way to processing. Pendleton, right behind him." "It's done," Samuel agreed, pulling the collar of his coat up against the wind. David looked back up at the towering federal courthouse, taking a deep, freezing breath of fresh air. The sting was over. The bad cop was behind bars. The arrogant manager had lost everything. But the job was never truly finished. "Get in," Harding said, tapping the roof of the SUV. "We just got a lead on a cartel money laundering front, operating out of a high-end casino in Detroit. Wheels up in 2 hours." David and Samuel exchanged a brief, knowing look. The shadows were waiting. The ghosts had work to do. They climbed into the back of the SUV, the doors slammed shut, and they disappeared into the endless flow of the city traffic, ready for whatever came next. This intense, real-life saga of Operation Checkmate proves that unchecked arrogance and deep-seated prejudice will inevitably lead to a devastating downfall. When Officer Mitchell Trent and Arthur Pendleton let their biases dictate their actions, they didn't just ruin their own lives, they blindly picked a fight with the highest levels of the federal government, and they lost everything. If you were captivated by this incredible story of undercover brilliance, absolute justice, and the dramatic unraveling of a corrupt officer, please make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling true stories.